Now, as we begin this third part for literature, I'd like you to pull out your notebook and go to the elements section of literature elements, and turn to character. And we have a quote that I'd like you to write down about Brian de Bois-Guilbert. And we'll just put Brian, and then go ahead and put quotation marks. So, as you write this down, let's go ahead and copy it into your notes section. Nothing could be more gracefully majestic than his step and manner, had they not been marked by a predominant air of haughtiness, easily acquired by the exercise of unresisted authority. So, what does this tell us about Brian? Of course, we're putting this in the character section of your notebook, so write this down, put quotations at the front and the back, but notice they're saying that he's gracefully majestic in his step and in his manner. So he carries himself gracefully. See, there's just something nice about that. This is a compliment. So the author is showing that Brian has a graceful majesty about him. He has this air of authority. But he also has this predominant air of haughtiness. Haughtiness is considering yourself high, and that you dominate others, and that you are prideful. And this has been easily acquired because he's always had unrestricted authority, or unresisted authority, I should say. So no one ever resists him, okay? Now, we also come to a section, I'd like you to stay there in the character section, and we're now going to write a little section on the Palmer. And of course we know that this Palmer is Ivanhoe, okay? He's disguised right now at this point in the book. Let's go ahead and read this section on top of 33. These two dignified persons were followed by their respective attendants, and at a more humble distance by their guide. Here's the Palmer, whose figure had nothing more remarkable than it derived from the usual weeds of a pilgrim. A cloak or mantle of coarse black serge enveloped his whole body. It was in shape something like the cloak of a modern hussar, having similar flaps for covering the arms, and was called a scavalon or scavonian. Coarse sandals bound with thongs on his bare feet, a broad and shallow hat with cockle shells stitched on its brim, and a long staff shod with iron, to the upper end of which was attached a branch of palm, completed the Palmer's attire. So I'd like you to just copy that little section there. That's on page. You guys know how to do this. This is his description. So you can start it by saying a cloak or mantle. A cloak or mantle. And just go ahead and continue your quote all the way over to, let's see, let's stop it there where it completed the Palmer's attire. So go ahead and write this out. You're going to have a long quote to write, but at the end, attire is going to be the final word. And then go ahead and put the quotation marks, and go ahead and put this on pause while you copy that quote. So as we resume, we want to go to page 36, and there's a section here to read. The first paragraph from the top of the page. When the repast, or the dinner, was about to commence, the major domo, or steward, suddenly raising his wand and said, "Forbear, place for the Lady Rowena." A side door at the upper end of the hall now opened behind the banquet table, and Rowena, followed by 4 female attendants, entered the apartment. Cedric, though surprised, and perhaps not altogether agreeably so, at his ward appearing in public on this occasion, hastened to meet her, and to conduct her with respectful ceremony to the elevated seat at his own right hand, appropriated to the lady of the mansion. All stood up to receive her, and replying to their courtesy by mute gesture of salutation, she moved gracefully forward to assume her place at the board. Ere she had time to do so, the Templar whispered to the prior, "I shall wear no collar of gold of yours at the tournament. The Chian wine is your own." "Said I not so?" answered the prior, "but checked your raptures. The Franklin observe you." So in other words, Brian is very taken with Rowena. He sees her great beauty, and he remarks that to the prior, but the prior warns him, "Well, I warned you," he says, "that she was beautiful, but watch the Franklin." Now the Franklin here, and we're going to just mark that in your notes, a Franklin is a Saxon landowner. So anyone who is a Saxon landowner, and of course that's where Benjamin Franklin gets his last name. So as you go back in history, his family owned land in Saxon England. Let's go back to the reading there. We're near the bottom of page 36. Unheeding this remonstrance, and accustomed only to act upon the immediate impulse of his own wishes, Brian de Bois Guilbert kept his eyes riveted on the Saxon beauty, more striking perhaps to his imagination, because differing widely from those of the eastern sultanas. Formed in the best proportion of her sex, Rowena was tall in stature. So here we have this description of Rowena. Let's go ahead and we're going to note some of the things I'd like you to underline. She was tall in stature, yet not so much as to attract observation on account of her superior height. Her complexion was exquisitely fair, but the noble cast of her head and features prevented the insipidity which sometimes attaches to fair beauties. Her clear blue eye, which sate enshrined beneath a graceful eyebrow of brown, sufficiently marked to give expression to the forehead, seemed capable to kindle as well as to melt, to command as well as to beseech. If mildness was the more natural expression of such a combination of features, it was plain that in this present instance the exercise of habitual superiority and the reception of general homage had given to the Saxon lady a loftier character, which mingled with and qualified that bestowed by nature. Her profuse hair, of a color betwixt brown and flaxen, was arranged in a fanciful and graceful manner in numerous ringlets, to form which art had probably aided nature. These locks were braided with gems, and being worn at full length, intimated the noble birth and the freeborn condition of the maiden. A golden chain to which was attached a small reliquary of the same metal hung around her neck. She wore bracelets on her arms, which were bare. Her dress was an undergown and kirtle of pale sea-green silk, over which hung a long, loose robe which reached to the ground, having very wide sleeves, which came down, however, very little below the elbow. So here's this description of her, and so I'm going to ask you to list several terms. I'm going to start with that she was very tall. Okay, so let's put down tall as we look at that section. And it mentions that people stood up for her, so she had kind of a commanding nature, right? So it mentions that she was beautiful, and she commanded respect from as she enters the room, okay? And she had a graceful eyebrow. So she is a beautiful countenance of her face, okay? And then it mentions that her hair, very long hair, and it's braided. And so her hair was in a graceful manner in numerous ringlets. Let's put down it was in ringlets. Now see, that's all external. What we're seeing here is this external character of Rowena. And so we can make a note there that she even has a golden chain around her neck and then a reliquary. So now a reliquary is like a little box on the end of the chain, kind of like a charm chain or necklace, but inside the box usually held a relic. I'm going to make a note here. A relic was something that was considered holy by the Catholic Church, like a piece of cloth that was worn by Apostle Paul, or a hair, or some like a splinter off the cross of Jesus. So things were kept and they were passed around and they were held as relics. And she had this little box around her neck, and so she, is dressed very well, okay? So let's go ahead and make a couple of comments about this. So she obviously cares about her presentation. She's keeps herself clean. She's neat. She has a very natural beauty. And she's kind of elegant. I mean, this whole passage really kind of shows an elegance, and she commands respect. So these are all things from her external character. Now, the next section we're going to look at is in chapter 5, right at the beginning. So if you would turn with me to page 40, now we're going to begin to see the attitudes towards the Jews in England. So as you have read this section, I hope that you have, you'll notice that a lot of people disliked the Jews back in those days. So the attitudes of the English were really pretty bad toward the Jewish people. They were definitely persecuted. And we're going to begin to see what these attitudes were. Now, chapter 5 starts with a quote from the Merchant of Venice. And you guys will have an opportunity to read the Merchant of Venice in the RGES high school program. But that is one of Shakespeare's great plays, and it's a tragedy. And it's a story of, part of the story deals with a Jew who is, and his name is Shylock, and he is persecuted, and Shakespeare is showing these bad attitudes that people had toward the Jews, but he's not joining those bad attitudes. Shakespeare is saying those are wrong. Those are wrong attitudes. So, look what he says here. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is? So Shakespeare's posing that question, that doesn't a Jew matter? Aren't they the same in terms of their value as a person, as a Christian? So are Christians going to be the only ones we value? Or do we value people who are different as well? because all men are made in God's image. So here's kind of what this great quote. I love these quotes that are set in the chapter because they give you a taste of what the chapter's about. So let's go down to about the 6th or 7th line into the chapter. It says, "A dog Jew," echoed the Templar, "to approach a defender of the Holy Sepulchre? By my faith," said Wamba, "it would seem the Templars love the Jews' inheritance more than they do their company." "Peace, my worthy guests," said Cedric. So remember, the Jewish man, Isaac, has come into the main room here at Rotherwood, and he's going to sit and have some dinner. And Cedric receives him. Look what he says. "My hospitality must not be bound by your dislikes. If heaven bore with the whole nation of stiff-necked unbelievers for more years than a layman can number, we may endure the presence of one Jew for a few hours. But I constrain no man to converse or to feed with him. Let him have a board and morsel apart." Now, so we see that he's letting Isaac come in. He's been gracious to give him food and let him dine. But notice he's not letting Isaac sit with anyone. He's not mentioning, hey, you have to let Isaac sit next to you. So you can see there were definite poor attitudes. But Cedric seems to have a pretty gracious attitude overall, letting the Jewish man come in and eat. Oh. You could definitely say that Cedric's character, although he's generous, he shows acceptance, but not a liking. He doesn't like Isaac. So even though he accepts Isaac, he doesn't like him. And this is part of what was happening in a lot of the European countries in at this time in the Middle Ages. Now, why was that? Well, a lot of the Christians in Europe saw that the Jews and believed that the Jews had crucified Jesus. And there was this sense in the church, this was such a tragedy. The Jews so mistreated Jesus, and then they crucified him, which is true, they did, but what they missed, I believe, in this was that it was God's will that Jesus die on the cross. God wanted that to happen from the very day that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He was going to die on the cross for our sin. And that's a great thing. That's what he came to do. He came to die for us. And so to blame the Jews for that seems really stupid when you think about it. You know, it was God's purpose that Jesus die on the cross. So we're going to take a look at this passage pertaining to Isaac, and we're just going to write a few things down from page 41 that indicate some of his character. Introduced with little ceremony and advancing with fear and hesitation, in many a bow of deep humility, a tall, thin old man, who, however, had lost by the habit of stooping much of his actual height, approached the lower end of the board. His features, keen and regular, with an aquiline nose and piercing black eyes, his high and wrinkled forehead, and long gray hair and beard, would have been considered as handsome had they not been the marks of a physiognomy peculiar to a race which during those dark ages was alike detested by the credulous and prejudiced vulgar, and persecuted by the greedy and rapacious nobility, and who, perhaps owing to that very hatred and persecution, had adopted a national character in which there was much, to say the least, mean and unamiable. The Jews' dress, which appeared to have suffered considerably from the storm, was a plain russet coat of many folds, covering a dark purple tunic. He had large boots lined with fur and a belt around his waist, which sustained a small knife, together with a case for writing materials, but no weapon. He wore a high, square, yellow cap of a peculiar fashion assigned to his nation to distinguish them from Christians, in which he doffed with great humility at the door of the hall. So you see, Isaac is introduced here. He having fear, he hesitates coming into the room, he has hesitation, he has a bow of humility. In other words, from the get-go, from the very beginning, when we meet Isaac, we see a person here who kind of acts like he's been abused, a person who is fearful, a person who hesitates coming in, because he has been. And so Christians, sadly, to Christians, we didn't treat the Jews with much love back then. In fact, there was a lot of hatred, a lot of persecutions. And so Christians even showed hatred for the Jews because they accused the Jews of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so here, because Isaac has been persecuted, and you'll see as we get into the story, part of the story here is this huge persecution that Christians did toward the Jews. And so he has this character. He says, quote, he had adopted So we can see that with all this fear and hesitation, here's a very, very good quote here. You can see, quote, he had adopted a national character in which there was much mean and unamiable. So he was not friendly. Isaac was not friendly. He was distant. He showed the marks of someone who had been abused, who had been, because he'd been mocked, and he just wasn't outgoing. He was fearful. People made fun of him. So he's not friendly. He's not amiable. In fact, he is even mean. Meaning mean means small. He comes across being kind of a small, slight person. And he even wears clothing that set him out as being a Jew. And it mentions here this yellow hat, this odd yellow hat. And it says that this was assigned to his nation. See? So there had to be certain clothes that the Jews would wear, that were assigned to them. Now, why did these Christians then even put up, if they didn't like the Jews and they didn't care for them, why did they even put up with the Jews? Well, the book goes into that a bit, and you'll notice as you read carefully that the Jewish merchants were very, very good businessmen, and I believe partly through God's blessing as well, because the Jews are God's chosen people, they had been blessed. And so part of this blessing is that they had earned much money. And so the monarchs of Europe often went to the Jews for loans. So they were approached for loans. And it mentions that Prince John had even negotiated with some of the Jews in York, England, for a large, large loan. So because the Jews had money saved, and because they were very careful in their commerce and in their business, they were approached for loans. They were the people who had the money, and so the kings of Europe often of course, valued the Jewish people, but they also sometimes hated the Jews because the Jews would charge high interest. Okay, as a good businessman would do, you're going to charge as high in interest when you make a loan as you possibly can. You're going to make as much money as you possibly can, but people are going to be upset with that. They don't want to pay high interest. So the very reason the Jews did so well with their money is another reason that they were not liked. Okay. Now on page 42, if you flip to that next page, we see some of this dislike. If you look at top of 42. On the contrary, as he passed along the file, he's coming into the room, casting a timid, supplicating glance and turning toward each of those who occupied the lower end of the board, the Saxon domestics squared their shoulders, and they continued to devour their supper with great perseverance, paying not the least attention to the wants of the new guests. So they're kind of ignoring Isaac. As Isaac comes in, they square their shoulders. They don't turn sideways in their seat so Isaac can kind of get in and kind of get up to the table, but they square their shoulders. They kind of make their shoulders square, and they try to touch shoulder to shoulder with the guy right next to them on either side. They're trying to block Isaac from getting at the table. So this had to make you feel awful. When you guys have gone into a room and people ignore you, or they try to, tell you with their body language they don't want you there, or they don't like you. It's really awkward, and it's hurtful. And this is what they do, and this is what they did to him all the time. So right in the middle of page 42, right down there in the big second paragraph, look what it says about Isaac. While Isaac thus stood an outcast in the present society, like his people among the nations, looking in vain for a welcome or resting place, the pilgrim who sat by the chimney took compassion on him and resigned his seat, saying briefly, "Old man, my garments are dried, my hunger is appeased, thou art both wet and fasting." So you can see how the pilgrim gets up. Of course, we know that's Ivanhoe in disguise. And he gets up and gives Isaac his seat. Look what he says. He says, "Old man, you can use this." So saying, he gathered together and brought to the flame from decaying brands which lay on the ample hearth, and took from the larger board a mess of pottage and seethed kid, placed it on the small table at which he himself supped, and without waiting the Jews' thanks, went to the other side of the hall. So very welcoming. He still moves across the hall, but he opens his own seat there next to the fire where it's warm and the Jew, Isaac, can be comfortable. Now, notice how they constantly call him the Jew. In fact, it's very hard until this page, on page 42, that they generally haven't even used his name Isaac. He's always the Jew moved here, the Jew did this, the Jew did that. And so Sir Walter Scott, in writing this book, is emphasizing that he's considered a Jew. He's a representative of the Jewish nation. And so the prejudice that the English had for the Jews is coming across on Isaac, and he's emphasizing that by calling him, the Jew did this, the Jew did that. He's always called the Jew. But now, notice how he's being accepted more by Ivanhoe. Now he's referred to as Isaac. So you see kind of a change in the language. This is really well written. Sir Walter Scott is showing us some things here, and he's a brilliant writer. So with that, we're going to close. I'd like you to write down this last quote, and this would go under character. And here's the quote. Isaac thus stood an outcast in the present society. ... There's 4 dots. End of quotation. Page 42. And so we're going to pick this up next week, and I'll look forward to... I sure wish I could see you guys today. It would be great to have you in class, but we're just going to have to wait until this coronavirus gets under control. So God bless you. Use the time well. Seek the Lord in the time that He's given you. And encourage people. Show the love you can for your family and your friends. And I'll look forward to seeing you when this stops. God bless you. Bye-bye.